I'm here with Pastor David Syme, and who's spent much of his life with his family serving in Africa, Asia, the US, here in Australia. Uh, David, we've been talking about culture, we've been talking about faith. In your work and in your life, you've interacted with a lot of people of different faiths.
Yes.
And I imagine in Islamic faiths as well.
Yes, absolutely.
What have you learned from your experience and time with, sharing who you are and what you believe with those of an Islamic faith?
Wow. Yes, I mean, I have had the privilege of working in a number of different, predominantly Islamic faith countries. And I must confess right up front that I feel really sorry for Islamic believers. They're having a bad trot. They're being...
In how they're understood and
everyone thinks Muslim, terrorist.
Right.
And that connection is absolutely wrong. And I must confess that all of my experiences in Pakistan, Bangladesh, across North Africa, in Mali and Niger and Burkina Faso and northern Nigeria, Mauritania, in all of my experience across those places, I have nothing really negative to say about Islamic people. I have found them to be tremendous friends. Elizabeth and I have a lady who we met in Kenya. I used to go to the mosque and talk about health in many mosques in Kenya when we lived there. And I was treated with the utmost courtesy, and always I found that I remember once in Kenya after the Friday night prayers when I started to talk about health is important for the body. And if our body was healthy, then our faith and our practice of our faith would be better.
Okay.
And the Imam stood up and said, "Now you're talking. Now you're really talking." And so I have found that...
So there was a shared value there.
Yes, there's some shared values that we don't explore sometimes. I think we're doing better at that, and we're starting to do that. But there's health values that we're very similar with. I'll give you one story that maybe demonstrates this idea of God's presence, or maybe two. I was ADRA, the Adventist Development and Relief Agency, which I had a strong hand in starting in 1983. And so I went out there and I met with the delegate of the European Union who was funding ADRA in Somalia to build wells and water spots for the camels, as well as the people. And we had a nice conversation because there were no air flights to there. We had to go in a UN plane and land in the middle of the desert, and then we were picked up by a cordon of four-wheel drive utes with machine guns in the back, because there was a lot of inter-ethnic war taking place at that time. Anyway, we were going for the opening of a very big well, a deep bore well that was producing water. And this was the beginning of when solar was starting. And so it was a solar-driven well out in the desert. As we talked, as I was leaving and said, "I'll see you at the airport tomorrow," he turned to me and he said, "I don't really believe in you faith-based organizations." And I said, "Oh, why is that?" He said, "Because," he said, "I think you only do it to proselytize and convert people to your own faith." And so I said to him, I said, "Oh, well, I'm sorry you believe that." I said, "ADRA actually," I said, "has a very strong and good record of keeping that kind of approach out of what they do. When ADRA was appointed a non-government organization consulting with the UN as an agency as a whole, the countries that put our names forward were two Islamic countries, Somalia and Sudan. And so, you know, we've had a good, strong record in this area. However, I said, what you will find in many countries of Africa is the local people, when you actually do things that are for their benefit, actually see it as the hand of God.
Right.
And they speak about it in religious terms. Oh, I don't think that's true, he said. No, I can't believe that. So I said, well, you know, that's how I have found it. And so the next day we flew together and we were taken up in our military escort to this place called Baghdad, not in the Middle East, but
Sure.
in the middle of Somalia. And there people were gathered, there was a tent put up, and we sat there out in the desert, and they provided us with a nice warm drink of camel milk, which was very traditional to take. And then the imam, the priest, they're called imams, stood up, and he was a very well-educated man, trained in Alexandria in Egypt. He had a lovely red turban on, showing his position.
Okay.
And he stood up and he said, we are so happy to have ADRA and the European Union here today to join us for this. Then he said, to our surprise, he said, our brothers from across the Red Sea haven't sent one sack of food to us here. But ADRA and the European Union, you followers of Jesus, Isa, have come to our rescue to bring us life.
Right.
And so God has come to us through what you have done.
Wow.
And I'm trying hard not to look at the EU, who is being counted as a follower of Isa. But this is exactly how they interpreted it.
I see.
Yeah.
Yeah, wow.
So that led to, on that same trip, I went south to a little village, fishing village called Adele. And there we had an ADRA midwife working in a small cottage hospital with a young, freshly graduated doctor. I was to make a film, and I filmed the water and what have you, but I wanted to get something from the hospital. So we arrived late, they put me in a bed, and it was very, very hot and humid. And I'm trying to, think about tomorrow and what I could film. In the middle of the night, I suddenly heard women wailing. And African women, pretty much across Africa, know how to wail when there's something sorrowful about to take place. And I immediately woke up because I'd heard it so often before. I knew it wasn't, when it's something good, they do what they call ululation. La, 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 la. I can't do it at all, but it is, and that's happiness. It's something good. But the wailing is something that it means something very serious is happening. And I grabbed my camera and I thought, here's a story. So I went to the hospital. It was dark. There was a generator running and there was a room. I knocked on it. The door was open. I walked in and it was a labor room. And on the bed was a young 16-year-old Somali woman who had been married and her husband had divorced her already. Her father was standing behind the bed and the doctor and the nurse were talking to each other. So I came in and thinking, well, here's a story. How can I cover this? And the doctor told me, he said, we cannot deliver her. She needs a cesarean section and we will try and take her to Mogadishu to get that done. But that's 3 3 hours across, and then how do you go on a camel?
Right.
Or even in a 4-wheel drive, there are dangers for all the fighting,
The conflict in that
conflict
area.
in that area. And the father said, we will take her home, and inshallah, if it is God's will, he said,
God willing.
yes,
inshallah.
God willing, she will have a child.
Okay.
If not, inshallah. Now, those of us from a medical background know that death of a child and a mother would be absolutely horrific and shocking, not just in the event itself, but in the dying.
Right.
Because we had worked outside of hospitals, out in the bush, I had learnt a procedure, a very old procedure that was 300 years old, made by a Spanish physician called symphysiotomy. And I won't go into all the details of it, but through this very simple approach, it is possible for the pubic bones to stretch and open up so that the baby can be born, and forceps, if necessary, can be put on. You see, when young women grow up in some of these countries where there is drought and insufficient food, and in cultures where the men eat first and the women eat last, a young woman coming into full womanhood will develop, but her pelvis will stay juvenile.
Right.
We call it pelvic dystocia.
Okay.
And so in that setting, this is the only option other than the cesarean. Today, we wouldn't do it. And even in those countries, they have the capacity. But then they didn't. They didn't have the capacity, and the doctor didn't have the experience. So I was caught in a hard place because I was there to make a film, but I knew that I knew how to do this other procedure. And so I explained to the doctor and the midwife what I proposed to do. But then, knowing that I'm dealing with an Islamic father, I said to him, I addressed him reverentially, and I said, I have come from countries afar to visit you here. And many years ago in the country to the north, I have seen cases like this, and I, by God's grace, inshallah, and using his language, his culture, by God's grace, inshallah, God willing, I may be able to do something that will not require opening a cesarean section, doing a cesarean, which I could do and have done, but not in that setting. And he spoke to me. He said, inshallah, I recognize you may have permission to examine my daughter, which I did. And then I decided that everything was all right. The baby was positioned correctly, just didn't have enough room to come through.
Okay.
So, to cut a long story short, I taught the midwife and the doctor, showed them the procedure, how to do it, but did it successfully by God's grace. And I mean, I'm praying during this time behind, because I hadn't done it for 17 years.
Right.
And so anyway, we were able to put on high forceps and deliver the child. And the daughter was happy. You could see, she knew if she went home, she would die.
Right.
And you could see it in her eyes.
Wow.
And all of a sudden she has a live baby boy. And I'm thanking God, silently for what had happened. Anyway, we took her to the ward, put the baby to the breast. And in the morning, which was about 2 hours later, we had to leave. I went in to see how she was. I had to make sure that after this procedure, the hips are strapped together tightly so that they can re-knit together. And the father appeared behind me in fresh white robes and a white cap. And he came to me with both hands, which is very unusual. Normally, you come this way, and this means I haven't got something hidden. He came with both hands to me and looked me straight in the eyes. And he said, Allah has sent you from afar to bring life and given me a baby boy. He was really happy about the boy bit.
Right.
Yeah. And he said, as my grandson grows up, he will sit with the elders around the fire at night, and he will tell the story of how Allah sent one of his followers to bring us all life.
Wow.
You know, and in this setting, you know, thank you, Lord, because in a way, he has been preached to, he has acknowledged the God that he knows, but also acknowledged our God, which we believe is the same God anyway, but differently understood. And in that we came together and he embraced me. So I've had circumstances like that working with Muslims that have been wonderful. I'll give you another example from Pakistan. We lived in Pakistan, we were called in 2006, so this is modern, fairly modern day,
Yeah.
2006, for the big earthquake up in Kashmir. And we spent 5.5 months, Liz and I, and up there dealing with the aftermath of a this terrible earthquake that killed nearly 85,000 children, not 85,000 people, including majority of them were children in schools, and schools just collapsed on them. So we were there. We were working 7 days a week. Our Sabbath day wasn't there. It was there, but it wasn't, because when it's winter and people are out in the cold, you know, you don't say, sorry, I can't come today because I'm going to church.
Yeah.
You know, you have to work. And so we worked through that place.
Wow.
I was working alongside the Taliban. But when I had arrived in Pakistan, just stepping back from that, when we arrived to do this, and it was in a place called Bagh City, my telephone, the Adra telephone rang, and the voice said, good evening, sir. I am Mr. So-and-so, and I am the chief of police in Bagh City. He said, one of your trucks has been attacked by a group of people. We have arrested them. We have your truck and most of your goods. And what punishment do you want me to give to the man? And I'd only just arrived in the country, and I thought quickly, Lord, you know, I need an answer here. And I said, Allah is merciful. And I said, I am a merciful man. I said, what he has done is bad. Please hold him under arrest until I can come to the city. And then I will expect an apology, a public apology. So anyway, I went to Bagh City about 3 weeks later. I had to fly in a Sikorsky helicopter with no doors on in the middle of winter, and arrived there. And we had an address set up. And then in the address setup, 90% of our workers working with us there with food, roofing, all sorts of things, were people of the Islamic faith, men and women together. And so they had set up a little tent right inside the entrance to Adra that was called the International House of Prayer.
Okay.
Because Muslims pray a lot. So this was a place where our Muslim workers could go and pray to their God. But we would also join them for morning worship, and we would pray in that setting with them. Anyway, I was notified that we had a gate, which was just a bamboo pole, you know, that was lifted, and that this man had been bought by the chief of police with his father to the man's father to the gate. And our gate was right in the middle of town. and there was a market nearby. And so when people saw something was happening, a huge crowd came around. So he said, I apologize to Adra. And
This is for stealing the van.
Yes, for stealing the van. I was drunk, he said. So I said, you don't need to apologize to Adra. I said, and the people were listening, I said, with this phone, I can ring one number on this phone and the whole program will stop immediately because of what has happened here. But I'm not going to do that. I said, you don't need to apologize to Adra, but you do need to apologize. Now the people are really listening. And I'm trying to talk in their culture and in their language. And he said, I'm sorry, doctor, for, what I did. Said, you don't need to apologize to me. So everyone's looking puzzled. I said, you need 3 apologies. I said, 1, you need to apologize to your father, for you have brought him shame. And within their culture, shame is a terrible thing.
Right.
And his head immediately dropped, just immediately dropped. You could see that he was absolutely sorry, So I said, you must apologize to your father. And here are the imams and muftis are all there in the crowd, and I can see them nodding their head,
right.
Starting to. They're wondering what this is going to be. Here's a Christian, a follower of Isa. What's he going to say? So I said, secondly, as I told you, I could have stopped this program immedately, but I didn't. You need to apologize to your community. And the people are not clapping, but you could see they're all in agreement. And so, but I said, the most important one for you is you need to ask Allah for forgiveness. And the priests were just, nodding their head, saying, this is absolutely right. This Christian is speaking our way in that setting, dealing with it. Now, God gave that to me on the spot. I had no preemption. I had nothing to read it by. But God was there, and he gave me the capacity at that moment to speak in that way. And then I said, will you do these things? He said, yes, I promise that I will do these things in front of all the people. And then I said, open the gate. And then I went and embraced him in the Islamic way.
Wow.
So in that setting then, whenever we had problems in the community would say, to the gate. That's where we need to deal with this.
Wow.
So it had put what was happening and our security into a kind of a religious setting.
Wow.
Then what the final crunch was that in our big tent that we had all our stuff, Adra Germany had sent to us a huge marquee that you would have at a big camp or something like that. It was really huge. Big tent. It was so huge that, you couldn't give it to someone to make their house in. It was too big. We didn't know how to use it. But the local mosque had been flattened and they had nowhere to go and pray to God.
Wow.
And so I called the muftis and the imams, and I told them, I said, if you will clear the rubble, we will bring a tent, because after the tragedy, all people, there was an unease, the social fabric was falling apart. Why? Because their religious base was falling apart, because there were no prayers at the mosque. And so we put that back. We gave them that marquee to serve as a mosque, but it came from Christians, and it was a statement about faith in the same. Some people may point the finger and say, oh, you shouldn't do that. Come on, what are you saying here? But I think that God led us to act in those ways. And I must tell you that in our setting, both Elizabeth and I had a wonderful time with them. On one occasion, when we had got back to having our day of worship, the first Sabbath of worship, when it was easy enough to stop having to work, we desperately needed email, and it wasn't working. It kept on cutting off. And so I talked to the director of the telephone company who worked across the road from our compound. And he gave us a phone. He went and bought a special phone that we could dial up through, and then that would put us straight onto an internet link. And he did it Friday afternoon. He paid for it with his own money. And he came Sabbath morning to be paid. And the guard came and said, Amen is here to get his payment. I said, would you go and tell Amin that we are at our prayers and I will come to see him? So when I went to see him with his money later, he was among a crowd of people in the middle of the whole post office where people paid stuff and what have you. So it was full of people, and he was with a crowd of younger men talking. And as I came, he fell at my feet and he said, I am so, so sorry. He said that I interrupted your prayers.
Okay.
He said, I am so, so sorry for it. And I picked him up and said, it's all right. And so then he said, so why do you, I can't understand it. I thought all Christians worshipped on Sunday.
Okay.
So then I said to him, well, God in the beginning, in creation, took one day off after he had created the world, and it was the seventh day. And we believe that God never changes, and so that is the proper day to worship God. And he said, of course, God cannot change his mind, He said, so what does Adventist mean? I said, Adventist means we believe that Jesus Christ is coming back to the world again to save the world. And he said, we Muslims believe that. It's in the Quran. Yes, he was a great prophet. So they have a little problem understanding as we do, but nonetheless, that knowledge was there. The next day he came over to the office and he whispered to me, he said, I've never been in a Christian church. Would you show me your chapel where you worship? It was nothing to write home about.
Sure.
It was a very old building, but we took our shoes off and we went in and I showed him the chapel. He invited Elizabeth and I that Friday to his home.
Okay.
Both of us. When we entered, expecting to see all of the women covered and what have you, as they were on the street, they were totally just in normal dress and what have you. His father, his mother were there, the whole family. And we sat down at a table and they asked me to say grace over the food.
Oh, wow.
Which I did. And the whole time we was together was comparing our faiths one with the other. Wow. But it was done within a setting that respected them as individuals and people of faith. I've got a lot of time for Muslims.
Yeah. And I appreciate, David, these stories that the common thread here is that respect has grown harmony and has been able to form relationships. And isn't that where faith is shared?
Yes, absolutely. Sometimes we rush in, my father used to stand in Hyde Park Corner on a box and preach.
Okay.
Someone threw a brick at him and he had that bump on the back of his head to the day he died.
Right.
But, I think faith is something that is about the whole of life, just not about our denominational differences and what have you. It is something about how we live out our lives before other people and recognizing them. It doesn't mean we endorse their theology or what have you, but at the same time, we endorse their commitment to faith in the God of heaven.
Beautiful. David, thank you so much for sharing these.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure.